You suggest in your book that John may have got Jesus may have got John arrested. Is that the case? Could you explain this to our viewers?
Yeah. So, yeah, like a lot of people who've come out of or come through a sort of a more conservative religious background, you go from being sort of naively, accepting of what the the biblical text says and trying to take it all as true. To quote Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, even the stuff that contradicts the other stuff. Right? And then you find you can't do that, and then you often swing to the other end of the pendulum and are like, "Yeah, I'm not going to trust any of this unless I've got some really, really strong evidence."
Right.
And I've hopefully, the pendulum has come somewhere a bit more in the middle. Because it seems to me that sometimes, precisely because we're reacting against that past naivete, we sometimes are overly skeptical, more so than any other historian would with some of these sources. And the Gospel of John, because it's so different from the others, tends to be viewed. It's like, I don't know if there's anything in here that's at all useful to a historian. Right. But we have this depiction of Jesus carrying out a baptismal activity before John is imprisoned. And the author of the gospel seems to be uncomfortable with this because he's like, they heard that Jesus was baptizing more than John, although Jesus wasn't baptized. And what the issue was is harder to pin down, but clearly there was something that they were uncomfortable about. And it's during that period when the Gospel of John says that John the Baptist has not yet been imprisoned, that it dates the famous action of Jesus in the temple. Right? So he goes in, causes a disruption, maybe puts some of his entourage at some of the entranceways to stop people taking shortcuts through it. He's overturning tables and scattering coins at animals and things like that. And says some sort of words, which we get different versions in different sources, about the temple being destroyed and rebuilt.
Right.
And just John placing that early, Mark places it late, and then Matthew and Luke follow it. And so most historians tend to go with, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But of course, it's really just Mark against John, and Mark didn't leave another place to put it. And John has this intriguing detail that, the temple has been, built for 46 years, right? Which would place it at, either the start of a sort of a 3-year public activity, or at a time earlier, and so it really does only seem to fit this scenario that the Gospel of John envisages, which is that this is before John's arrest and Jesus starting this period of activity that we get in the Synoptic Gospels. And so if Jesus does that as part of John's movement, as essentially John's emissary, his apostle, if you will, then there's this interesting connection with something that Josephus tells. Right? Josephus says that Herod was worried about the crowds that John was gathering, his influence, and it seemed as though they were ready to do anything that he might ask them to. And the only thing that I can think of that we know that John asked people to do, other than, if you have 2 tunics, give one to somebody who doesn't have one, right? But the only thing that might draw the attention of somebody like Herod Antipas is if Jesus is part of John's movement and is representing him in carrying out this disruption in the temple, right? Even though this is not Antipas's territory, he's going to hear about this, and he's going to think, this guy's doing a lot of stuff in my territory too. And so I think that in that sense, Jesus's action at John's behest, I imagine, may have led rather directly to John's arrest and ultimately to his demise, right? His execution. And if that's the case, then not only the way that Jesus talks about John and the way people react to him and respond to him, but also the way he starts to re-envisage his own activity as requiring that he follow a route of humility, that there'd be no taking up of arms, that he's not going to be acting with strength in that way that many people were hoping and expecting, that he might need to be a figure more like John, right? That it might be the path of not just John, but also the stronger one, to be willing to suffer and for God to be the one who vindicates them, so that it's following that pattern that, again, was so deeply rooted in the Hebrew Bible, where when somebody says, I'll set the Israelites free, and it's like, okay, you're gonna need some time in the wilderness, right? And then when you're like, I can't even speak, it's like, okay, you're ready now, right? So that too may have had deep roots, but I think Jesus was influenced by John. But Jesus, imagine how, that story has never been really fleshed out,
Right.
how Jesus might have been impacted by John's death if Jesus' involvement in John's movement had a direct, sort of impact on how those events transpired.
Right. And it's an interesting theory, but I do like the idea that Jesus was a part of John's ministry. Jesus was part of John's movement, and that John's death was the thing that not only caused, the two movements to separate and John's people joined, but was the thing that actually catapulted Jesus to say, okay, my time has come now. Let's get going, because I realize what this is about. And that really, maybe that was the thing that turned his face towards Jerusalem, but it was one of these things, a monumental thing in his mind that says, oh, I see what's required now. Something, maybe. I like the theory. It's an interesting theory, especially since you're tying it in with the timing in Josephus.
Yeah. And that may be, one of the possible future book projects is to really dig into, can we, because on the one hand, if there's something that scholars are skeptical about and historians are skeptical about, it's, Jesus sort of foreseeing and, potentially giving some sort of interpretation to the significance of his own death. Right. And that's so laden with theology and, hindsight that, it's like, we're never going to cut through this, right, as historians. On the other hand, it seems as though, the very way that things unfold, the fact that there was enough there that, Christians who are experiencing severe cognitive dissonance after the crucifixion nonetheless had enough to work with in the life and teaching of Jesus that they could find a way to navigate that. There's something there that certainly is worth, whether it's me or others who come after me, deserve some further attention, I think.